Welcome to a webcast hosted by Socialist Action. We acknowledge that this event takes place on the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit and Haudenosaunee people, and on Indigenous lands known as Turtle Island. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. Today, we are very pleased to be hosting a discussion titled The World Votes in 2024. International Politics and Global Capital, with special guests Dimitri, Lascaris, and Radhika Desai. The webcast has been recorded and will be posted on the SA YouTube channel. I hope you enjoy it. My name is Elizabeth Bice, and I'm a leading member of Socialist Action and a chair for this meeting. This year, we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of the founding of Socialist Action in Canada. If you want to change the world, please get directly involved in our party. We warmly invite you to join Socialist Action. 2024 has been described as the largest election year in human history, with potentially over half the world's population going to the polls in an era of crisis ranging from climate change to the threat of nuclear war. The inability of bourgeois democracy to solve widespread problems that has never been clearer. At the same time, the concentration of wealth and political power in a global capitalist class infused the historic election year with opportunity and significance for the pathways ahead. Shakeups within the domestic and foreign policy realm of powerful state actors have come into focus. Are the class forces of global capital and the electoral politics shaping the world? And what should socialists keep in mind as we analyze the moving parts? Let's begin with Radhika. Radhika is a professor at the Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg and the director of Geopolitical Economy Research Group and the convener of International Manifesto Group. She proposed a historical materialist approach to understanding world affairs in her 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy. After U.S. hegemony, globalization, and empire. Radhika has published dozens of books, over 100 articles and book chapters on UK, India, US, and European politics, as well as on international political economy. She is a regular contributor to CGTN, Counterpunch, Frontline, The Guardian, The Hindu, RT, and the Valide Discussion Club. She hosts a popular online fortnightly show called Geopolitical Economy Hour, and her most recent book is Capitalism, Coronavirus and War, a Geopolitical Economy. Welcome, Radhika. You're muted.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thanks to Socialist Action for inviting me again to appear before you and offer some thoughts. I just wanted to say that, honestly, I'm sure everybody is thinking about it. If there is any sign that we live in profoundly undemocratic times, it is the fact that the United States and our generally Western governments that so love to consider themselves democratic are supporting the state of Israel and its genocidal policies, of which we have seen the most recent instance yesterday, in which they killed a leading Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. Okay, let me just dive into the discussion. So basically, I guess I would like to begin by saying that, of course, as we see with the year of elections, it's clear that the exercise of the vote has now become very widespread. But I think it's important to bear in mind that the following, which is that never has the exercise of the vote been more widespread, but never has democracy been more undermined, been more under threat, been more essentially stripped of substance, been hollowed out. So I would say that the crisis is so grave as to require a fundamental re-examination of whether capitalism can ever be democratic and why we ever thought it could, because we clearly did, or most people in the Western countries certainly did. The dangers that democracy faces are not the ones that the US Democratic Party or the British Labour Party or any other such establishment force, which essentially combines neoliberal policy with tokenistic social liberalism, are warning about. Those warnings have only to do with vilifying their opponents, tarring them with the brush of being anti-democratic. The real threat comes from neoliberalism, and it has been undermining democracy for more than 4 decades already right now. And before we go ahead and before anybody accuses me of using the word neoliberalism in order to excuse capitalism, let me clarify that my belief is that neoliberalism is capitalism, that that in its neoliberal form is the only form capitalism can take any longer. And it is the only reason I specify neoliberalism is because I wish to distinguish it from the previous period, the period preceding neoliberalism, during which the marriage of democracy and liberal democracy and capitalism seemed to work after a fashion. It's a very short period of historical time. And by that period, I mean the 3 or 4 decades or 3 decades roughly that followed the end of the Second World War. Of course, we all know what neoliberalism is. It combines an attack on unions, a weakening of working class organization, cuts in social spending, privatization of state-owned enterprises, contracting out of many other elements of the state, outsourcing, of course, of production to lower wage countries, a certain triumphalism around the end of Soviet and Eastern European communism, and an assumption that China is going the same way, which if we get a chance to talk about it, I would say that, the existence of communism, of course, put a lot of pressure on Western countries to at least seem to promote popular interest and so on, which was gone by then. Neoliberalism has been accompanied by stagnant wages, the privileging of big corporations over even smaller capital, let alone working people, the lifting of capital controls worldwide, giving capital a freedom that it had not had through most of the decades after the Second World War. And that came, of course, with the financialization of economies and the undermining of its productive capacities throughout the Western capitalist world. A shift of the historic parties of the working class to liberalism, attacks on civil liberties, increasing censorship, restrictions on the exercise of the franchise, which may not, for example, simply by doing things like requiring voter ID to vote, etc., increasing restrictions on that, money and media-focused electoral strategies, and finally, oddly enough, a proliferation of scholarly discourses that talk about democracy, but in fact are about actually limiting democracy. And I'll say something about that a little bit more later on. So these things are kind of relatively well known, but there are a couple of things about neoliberalism that are not widely appreciated. So the first is that neoliberalism is very much, voices the discourses, it uses discourses about freedom and, of course, even democracy and so on. But in reality, it is profoundly authoritarian. And this we can best understand if we appreciate the fact that the imposition of neoliberal policies, which in most Western countries began from about 1980 onwards, though, of course, in Chile, we saw an important prelude with the 1973 coup against Salvador Allende. And the imposition of General Pinochet's rule with the arrival of the Chicago Boys to restructure the Chilean economy in an exceedingly pro-capitalist direction. So anyway, this 1980s were preceded by the decade of the 1970s, which were really beginning from the late 60s onwards. This was an entire period of proliferating popular protests, student protests, strikes, feminism, the beginnings of environmentalism, national liberation movements, the troubles in Ireland, you name it, there were a whole host of popular protests. It was a decade of contestation in the context of a broader crisis of capitalism. And during this period, the elites were extremely alarmed, and we should remind ourselves that during this period, the Trilateral Commission was appointed by major Western governments, which issued a very famous report called The Crisis of Democracy, in which they basically opined that the problem that Western countries faced was an excess of democracy. So obviously, then the thing to do would be to reduce the amount of democracy. So that's the first point. So that the attack on trade unions, etc., it was not simply something economic, although that was also involved, but it was also an outright attempt to try to reduce the power of anti-systemic forces. And the second important thing I want to say about neoliberalism, which people tend to forget, partly because neoliberalism uses the rhetoric of free markets and competition, is that neoliberalism is not about free markets and competition. It's not about creating a competitive capitalism. It is primarily about advancing the interests of big, gigantic corporations. That's what neoliberal policy has been about. So as I say, they in the name of giving freedom to capital, they actually give an excess of freedom, I should say, to the biggest forms of capital, who have over the last many decades, of course, continued to grow bigger, continue to financialize, continue to become more and more authoritarian, repressive, etc. So this is primarily what neoliberalism is about. And precisely the gap between the rhetoric of free market and competition and the reality of neoliberalism advancing the interests of the big corporation points to the fact that, which I consider very important, which is that neoliberalism and the neoclassical economics on which it rests is primarily, or should be seen as, a gigantic intellectual fraud. That's what it has always been. So exactly what neoliberalism is doing to democracy can be understood by taking into account the following slightly schematic outline, which I will now present before you, a sort of a schematic way of looking at the history of the relation between capitalism and democracy. So capitalism in itself, left to its own, is not democratic. Capitalism is liberal, and the core of the freedoms that it protects is the freedom of private property, which is in itself a profoundly inegalitarian freedom, because, of course, the freedom of some to possess private property, by which I don't mean your toothbrush or your jeans or your books, I mean the means of production, the factories, the farms, the mines, etc. Freedom of private property, the freedom of this private property necessarily derives the vast majority of the people from owning the means of production, and then they must work for those who do own the means of production. So this capitalism is liberal, and it is representative. It must be representative in the sense that, because its ruling class, the capitalist class, is essentially a rather a large, fractious, competing, conflicting class, the mutual interests of the capitalist class must be brokered. And they are typically brokered in parliaments, where essentially the representatives of various capitalists come and they broker the interests of the capitalist class. So it is liberal and it is representative. It is not necessarily democratic. It was made democratic through popular struggle. Popular struggles were for the extension of the franchise, first to include working class people, eventually also to include women, etc., came about, as I say, as a result of popular struggles. However, as our own Canadian Marxist philosopher C.B. Macpherson repeatedly pointed out, in this process of making liberal capitalism a bit democratic, democracy became liberalized. That is to say that it became essentially adapted to living side by side with this highly inegalitarian social organization of society that was capitalism. So democracy in this process got liberalized. The essence of popular participation seemed to consist of competing interests and so on. So the logic of competition was brought into it. And more importantly, I would say that it was also liberalized in the sense that there are strict constitutional limitations to what a majority can do in a capitalist society. For example, it cannot take away people's property without compensation. This is the core protection that capitalism enjoys. Moreover, I would add that people forget how late universal adult franchise, how recently it has arrived in capitalism. So initially, you had elected elements to democracy in the 19th century even, but the arrival of, you can only say, I mean, these were based on very restricted franchises. So the extension of the franchise to include the entire adult population is largely, I would say, a post-Second World War phenomenon. And I point this out because you could show, in fact, people have shown that, universal adult franchise is more or less adopted in many countries in the early 20th century. But unfortunately, the unpreparedness of capitalist societies to deal with this led to an enormous surge of authoritarian politics, which included, whose sort of battering ram, whose sharpest edge was fascism. So after this early part of the 20th century was over, and the Second World War ended, fascism was, at least in its most excessive forms, defeated, although fascists continued to remain in power in many countries. But some kind of accommodation was then in the post-Second World War reached, and you could say that there was an extension of the franchise in the post-Second World War period. Although in the case of the United States, which loves to go about banging the drum of how it is democratic, etc. In the case of the United States, you can't say that you had effective universal adult franchise until the Jim Crow laws were repealed in the 1970s as a result of civil rights agitation. So really, democracy in the United States is not that old, and it is already in crisis. But also there's another thing you have to remember about these post-Second World War decades, and that is that capitalism and democracy seem to coexist for some decades, not because somehow capitalism was compatible with democracy, but because it was quite radically reformed with all sorts of socialistic reforms in this period. And these reforms, essentially the polar opposite of neoliberalism, macroeconomic policy aimed at full employment, not inflation cutting, substantial public ownership, the extension of welfare states, the extension of union rights, a whole host of such reforms were what made, for this brief time, capitalism and democracy to coexist. It allowed them to coexist. Of course, as I say, in a sense, they are quite incompatible because the logic of capitalism is inegalitarian, while the logic of democracy is the opposite. So insofar as neoliberalism involved a rollback of these socialistic reforms following the crisis of the 1970s, during which, as I always point out, the Western societies had a choice. Should they deepen the socialistic, post-Second World War socialistic reforms, going more towards some kind of socialism? Or should they, as the neoliberals began to advocate, should they roll back these reforms in the expectation that these reforms is what is burdening capital and capitalism, and that unburdened from these socialistic restraints, unburdened from these social obligations that it represented. Remember, progressive taxation was another very important part of this. Unburdened from these obligations, capitalism would revive, it would reacquire its productive dynamism. Of course, so all of the rollback of these things essentially could not but spell danger for democracy in the capitalist world. And of course, the imposition of neoliberalism within a decade, the first decade of the imposition of neoliberalism in Western societies, you began to see a proliferation of literature complaining about its effects on democracy. So, for example, Barry Gills and Joel Rocamora edited a book in which they talked about low-intensity democracy. Meanwhile, Noam Chomsky used the expression democracy light. Democracy was clearly on a diet. And as many political scientists have pointed out, the result has been rising voter apathy, increasing volatility in terms of party preferences, and on the part of voters, and on the part of elites, an attempt to try to depoliticize politics. What we've seen is an attempt to sort of say, well, we should have more and more decisions that used to be made through political means to be made through apolitical means. Experts should make these decisions. And the most perhaps significant of these is the rhetoric around creating and ensuring the independence of central banks, so that, and of course, the independence is only independence from the popular wishes. In reality, independent central banks are the slaves of the wishes of big financial institutions and essentially rich people. So, so this depoliticization of politics has also occurred. And it's precisely in this period, however, that we also began to see more than ever before a celebration of the relationship between democracy and capitalism. Most famously, of course, Francis Fukuyama coming out and saying that, now, especially after the collapse of Eastern European and Soviet communism, that, basically we are now looking at essentially history has ended, because humankind in many parts of the world have already reached that wonderful combination of capitalism and liberal democracy, which is the best way to organize society. There is nowhere further to go, no further social changes are required. And those countries that are not quite there yet, well, they will simply catch up, and that is where we will all end up. And to me, by the way, another element that of the undermining of democracy is that in practically every major country, increasingly, politics has become a matter politics is handled by members of the professional managerial class, and not by people who various parties are supposed to represent. So not businessmen do not represent, are not the representatives of parties of business. Workers are not the representatives of parties of the working class, etc. So that is also something that has sort of given rise to what I would call a sort of astroturf politics, insofar as there were any grassroots elements to democracy or democratic politics in the post-Second World War period. This has disappeared. And of course, this has been accompanied by the fact that the historic parties of the working class have essentially surrendered to neoliberalism. They have accepted neoliberalism as the only kind of economic policy that they can implement, and combined it with a very tokenistic social liberalism to distinguish themselves from more right-wing forms of politics. Now, in this context, so this is the context of an extremely, how can you say, a denatured, hollowed out democracy that we are enjoying today in most of the world. And in this context, the neoliberal establishment, which today consists primarily of parties of the center left, so to speak, many of them are historic parties of the working class. These people essentially have taken to talking about the danger to democracy as consisting in the rise of populism, both of the right and of the left. So they will say things like, well, Trump or Johnson represent the populism of the right, and Bernie Sanders or Jeremy Corbyn represent the populism of the left, and it is important, therefore, to protect democracy from it. And the purpose of this rhetoric is essentially to discredit all possible challenges to this type of establishment. However, the word populism does not even begin to comprehend the political dangers that people and their democratic aspirations actually face. To me, I think it's important to move away from this discourse of populism and understand that there are two main political forces in contention today. And they are both profoundly right-wing and authoritarian. So there is the neoliberal establishment, which hypocritically seeks to portray itself as democratic and progressive and even egalitarian, but in reality represents the interests of the corporate capitalist class in a completely, shall we say, unadorned fashion. While on the other hand, the anti-establishment force is even further to the right. It is in many ways sort of seeks to mobilize people on a racist, sexist, misogynist basis, and whose politics are capable of shifting shape much more, depending on what they need to do in order to win elections, the very hollowed out elections that they must nevertheless still try to win. Sorry?
Sorry, Radhika, go ahead.
Yeah. Right. So basically, around the world, it seems to me that the voice of the people is being suppressed by these forces. And only the small, but every so often, genuinely popular forces seem to sort of seem to assert themselves here and there. And I'm thinking of instances like, of course, the forces that Jeremy Corbyn represents. I'm not necessarily entirely endorsing all the politics of these politicians, but what I'm pointing to is the genuine desire for genuine democracy that backs these political figures. So people like Corbyn or Sanders. Today, people like Sarah Wagenknecht in Germany. These are the forces that are, and of course, I should add, since we are here with Dimitri, the hundreds of, certainly the thousands of people who joined the Green Party precisely because he was running on a progressive platform. All of these, so every so often you see these forces emerging, but on the whole, there is not much to give them expression. So. So I think that I've kind of used my time. So what I'm saying basically is that what we are seeing in France, in Britain, in India, in Germany more recently, what we will see in Austria tomorrow, more and more what we are seeing is essentially the competition between these two types of forces, with the voice of ordinary people being suppressed, because thanks to the left having essentially surrendered to, the historic left having essentially surrendered to neoliberalism, the task of building a new left political force that is capable of taking power still remains to be done. So that, I mean, I wanted to put out this analysis first, and then we can discuss the actual instances of the various countries going to elections in the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you very much. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is a lawyer, journalist, and activist who focuses on human rights, environmental law, and global political economy. He is the former justice critic of the Green Party of Canada and was the foremost left-wing contender in the 2020 Green Party of Canada leadership race. After graduating from the University of Toronto of law in 1991, Dimitri began his legal career at the Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, first working from the firm's New York offices and then joining the firm's offices in Paris, France. In 2012, Dimitri was elected by Canadian Lawyers magazine as one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada, and again in 2023. Dimitri is a principled and outspoken activist for human rights, Palestinian rights, and an advocate for an anti-imperialist, anti-war world order. Dimitri has been courageously reporting from the front lines of political conflict, such as Lebanon, Russia, and Venezuela. Welcome, Dimitri.
Thank you very much for having me. Always a pleasure to join my comrades at Socialist Action. Just a word of warning, I'm in my house in Kalamata, Greece, which is an old house up on a mountain, and the internet connection here is problematic. So you may lose me at some point. This happens a fair bit during my Zoom calls, but I'll be gone for, typically what happens is I'm gone for 60 to 90 seconds and then I come right back on. And by the way, those of you who are concerned about the recording will continue. So you can maybe chat if I disappear during the course of my speech, and I'll be right back. Because of the momentous events of the last 48 hours, and be very candid with you, I didn't have an opportunity to prepare a speech. Usually, almost invariably when I'm invited to give presentations, I spend quite a bit of time preparing. So I didn't have that opportunity over the past 48 hours. I decided, however, and I let the organizers know this before we began today, that I wanted to talk about what I regard as the most pressing issue of our time, and that is war. But as I was listening to Radhika speak, I thought that I thought I'd like to talk about another subject for the majority of my presentation, which is very much related to the wars that we are experiencing, and that is this whole, what I call, scam around foreign interference, alleged foreign interference in Canada's allegedly democratic processes and institutions. So why do I call it a scam? First of all, and I'm going to get into this in some more detail, I believe there's little to no credible objective evidence to back up the claim that China and Russia are interfering in Canadian or US politics in any meaningful way. The second reason for which I call this a scam is that the states that probably are interfering in a meaningful way in our politics are being ignored. And in my opinion, those two states are not the only ones, but those two states are principally the United States and Israel. And no one in the mainstream discourse even suggests that we should be concerned about potential interference by the United States or Israeli governments in Canadian politics. So that, to me, is part of the scam. But the biggest reason I call it a scam is that they're lying to us about their reasons for focusing so much of their attention and our attention on this issue. When I say they, I'm referring to the corporate media and to the political elite in Canada. They claim that they are focusing on this issue to protect and strengthen our democracy. But in fact, the opposite is true. They are generating hysteria about foreign interference in order to undermine our democracy, or what remains of it. And in particular, they're using this hysteria around foreign interference, which they're investing so much energy in generating, to bolster support for the suppression of our right of free speech and free association. They're using it to increase public support for, or at least tolerance for, stratospherically high military and security budgets, which, of course, is diverting much needed public funding for socially beneficial purposes. And thirdly, they're generating this hysteria to build public support for, or at least tolerance of, a more militaristic and belligerent policy towards Russia and China, which, to put it bluntly, could get us all killed. So that's essentially why I call it a scam. So how did this scam begin? The scam began in the 2016 election when the Democrats put up to run against Donald Trump a candidate who, by any rational measure, is fantastically unfit to be the manager of the local outhouse, let alone the president of the United States of America. They put up against him Hillary Clinton, who, as John Kiriakou, a CIA whistleblower, says, was probably the only Democrat who could lose to Donald Trump. And immediately upon the Democratic Party elite realizing that Trump might win, and then having to deal with the fact of Hillary Clinton's loss, the claim began to be advanced aggressively, extremely aggressively, by the Democratic Party elite, by the national security apparatus in the United States, and by the corporate media, that Russia had stolen the election. And one of the ways in which it was claimed Russia did this was that they hacked into the DNC server and obtained a bunch of emails sent by or to John Podesta, they being the Russians. This was the allegation. And that they then handed over the emails to Julian Assange and WikiLeaks, and they proceeded to make Hillary Clinton look bad during the course of the campaign. Well, this allegation was looked at in considerable, it wasn't the only allegation, but this is one of the core allegations. It was looked at in considerable detail by one of the most technologically sophisticated people in the US government. I believe his name is Bill Bitter, but I may have that wrong. And this gentleman concluded that it was impossible that the emails were accessed remotely by, for example, a foreign intelligence service, and that it had to have been done by somebody downloading the emails onto a USB key. So the whole theory that Russia stole these emails and then handed them over to WikiLeaks was completely exploded by the technical analysis. And we then discovered, and the other problem with this whole narrative, of course, was that the emails were not in fact disinformation at all. They were authentic emails. They weren't fake emails. They actually were Podesta's emails. And one of the things that they showed was that Hillary Clinton and the Democratic Party National Committee cheated Bernie Sanders out of the nomination. One of the ways in which they did that was feeding Hillary Clinton the debate questions when she was going to debate Bernie. So she had a huge advantage going into those debates because she knew what the questions were going to be. So effectively, what the Podesta email revealed was the truth. It wasn't disinformation. It was a truth that was very embarrassing to the Democratic Party. It had nothing to do with Russian interference in the 2016 election. Now, sadly, nobody in Canada's political elite seems to have understood that this whole thing was a fraud, and that in fact the evidence, and this, by the way, was borne out amply by the investigation of Robert Mueller, the former FBI director, who spent millions of dollars and many months investigating the allegations and came up with butt gifts. Was unable to establish that anybody in the Trump campaign was colluding with anybody in the Russian government to subvert the outcome of the election. Nonetheless, the Canadian political elite and corporate media have simply ignored what the Mueller investigation found, ignored the fact that it's technically impossible for the Russian intelligence service to have hacked into the DNC server and obtained these emails, which revealed the truth about the Democratic Party. And they continue to repeat the mantra here in Canada and in the United States that Russia basically stole the 2016 election. So that's the background. That's how this whole scam began. And then it quickly migrated over to Canada, as so many unfortunate tendencies of US politicians ultimately do. Fast forward to the last year or so. Apparently, at some point during, I think, the past year to 2 years, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service generates a report for the Prime Minister, a classified report, which purports to show that the Chinese government is interfering aggressively in Canadian politics. And as I understand it, the senior foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister looked at the report and essentially decided it was a nothing burger, which it is, by the way. It's a nothing burger. And Trudeau, therefore, didn't take the report particularly seriously. Well, this got some people inside CSIS quite worked up. And so they began to leak information from a classified report to the press, and principally to the Globe and Mail, to these two characters, Robert Fife and Chase, I believe, Stephen Chase, who are effectively mouthpieces for the Canadian Security Intelligence Services, and began to make the Prime Minister look very bad, as if he was weak in the face of Chinese interference. And so this created quite a hullabaloo, as I'm sure you all know, in Canadian politics. The Trudeau government's alleged failure to take this intelligence seriously about Chinese interference. And so a couple of things happened as a result of the panic generated within the Trudeau government about this. One of the things is that the Trudeau government decides to have the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliament release a redacted version of a report on Chinese interference. And I'm going to come back to that in a second. And the second thing that happens when Trudeau panics, because he's under extraordinary heat from the corporate press and CSIS and the political opposition to take this, conspiracy of the people in the Chinese government to interfere in Canadian politics seriously, he sets up a judicial inquiry to look into the question of interference in Canada's last two elections and what to do about it. So let me say a word, first of all, about the National Security Intelligence Committee report. It's about 84 pages, if I recall correctly. I read this report twice. I read it with from the perspective of a lawyer. I practiced law for over 30 years, and I litigate. So I've learned a thing or two, hopefully, course of those 30 plus years of litigation about assessing witnesses' credibility, the probity of evidence, and the relevance of evidence, and the independence of evidence. And this report, in my opinion, is almost completely devoid of any credible evidence whatsoever. Absolutely no evidence of any significance. The report essentially just says over and over again, particularly in the footnotes, CSIS says this and CSIS says that. So in other words, the committee is just basically taking CSIS's word for it. Now, maybe some of you aren't troubled by that, but I happen to be concerned about it because on several occasions, Canadian courts have said that CSIS are a bunch of liars. And very politely, they've said that they are constantly making misrepresentations to the courts. They're subverting the course of justice. And in a very recent decision, a judge, again, he said it politely as he could, but he said that the misrepresentations coming from CSIS to the court were systemic. And this is after CSIS had already been accused on numerous occasions by judges and others of dishonesty. So why would anybody take CSIS's word about anything at face value? Okay. And the other thing is CSIS has a motivation to generate hysteria around this subject. And that is because if there's hysteria around this subject, it's going to be easier to get more money out of the budget for CSIS. Obviously, they make themselves seem much more important and necessary to the Canadian public, and therefore they can make the case that they deserve to have hundreds of millions of more dollars thrown at their corrupt and dishonest organization. So that's the first problem with this report. The second problem with this report that they put out in June in heavily redacted form was that it repeated all this nonsense about Russian interference in the 2016 election, as if it was gospel, when in fact, as I mentioned, the Mueller report essentially debunked the whole scam. So what about this inquiry, this foreign interference inquiry? Well, the inquiry is being conducted by a judge, a Quebec judge, creates this, political problem for the Trudeau government by giving these leaks to its moles, what I consider to be moles in the Globe and Mail, and making Trudeau look weak and feckless on, so-called interference by the Chinese government. So Trudeau does two things. He gets the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliament to release the classified report in heavily redacted form. And he also gets a judge to conduct a judicial inquiry into foreign interference. So with respect to the report, again, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I read that report. It was published in June of this year twice. I forced myself to read it twice, looked at it with a critical eye, found absolutely no credible evidence to support the foreign interference allegations in it. It was just repeating what CSIS had said without disclosing any of the so-called evidence that CSIS has based its conclusions upon. And by the way, there was an interesting interview that Elizabeth May gave about that report. She actually went and got clearance to view classified information so that she could see the report in unredacted form. And then after she read it in unredacted form, she couldn't tell people what she read, but she was asked to give her assessment of it. And what she said was, it's not really evidence in there. So it's not like the redactions are concealing evidence. Elizabeth May herself, who's a lawyer, read the damn thing without any redactions and said, there's no evidence in there. So with the respect to the judicial inquiry, which is the second reaction that Trudeau, or the second thing that Trudeau did to try to deflect concern about this over his alleged indifference to Chinese interference, he appoints a Quebec judge to conduct a judicial inquiry into foreign interference. She's doing her inquiry in two stages. And the first stage was looking at potential interference into the last two Canadian elections. And the second part of her inquiry is dealing with how to address foreign interference in the future. So she issues her report on the first half, whether there was foreign interference in the last two elections, in May of this year. And in it, she says, yes, there was some foreign interference. And by the way, that part of her report is based, as far as I can tell, entirely upon what CSIS is telling her. Okay, this profoundly untrustworthy organization. But she goes on to say that it didn't have any impact on the last two elections. None. And she even says that Canada's democratic processes remain robust. So in fact, the judgment of the National Security Advisor of Trudeau that this was a nothing burger appears to have been entirely justified. Now, the second half of her inquiry is going to address how to deal with foreign interference in the future. Between the first half and the second half, I was retained by an intervener in this judicial interference or foreign interference inquiry, and the intervener is the Iranian Canadian Congress. And I'm speaking here now on my own behalf and not on behalf of my client. Okay, these are my own views, which they may or may not share. But my impression now, I've been involved in this foreign interference inquiry for about 6 weeks as counsel to an intervener, is that nobody in that inquiry is remotely interested in challenging the so-called evidence supporting the claim that China and Russia are interfering in Canadian politics, number one. Number two, no one is remotely interested in examining whether any so-called allies of Canada, like the United States and Israel, are engaging in any foreign interference. And number three, they're all mortified of the possibility that somebody might come in there and begin questioning the entire narrative. Absolutely mortified, and they are obsessed with security. I have never seen in any kind of a judicial proceeding in my entire career anybody who was so preoccupied with, the potential for leaks or spyware or malware. I mean, it's just paranoia, frankly, is what it strikes me as. And so I'm getting a sort of inside look at how the institutions of power in this country are dealing with this scam, and it's frankly quite frightening. Now, why do I think that all of this is important? Well, because, as I said, this is being used to justify censorship, impair our freedom to associate with others. And I'm going to give you a very good example of this, which is personal to me and Radhika. Okay, the Hill Times published an op-ed last week. The op-ed was drafted by this character named Marcus Kolga at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, who purports to be a disinformation expert. Now, I've looked into Marcus Kolga, and for the life of me, I can't understand why anybody would consider this clown to be a disinformation expert. Okay, he has, and this is no knock on political science, he has a degree in political science, an undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois, and that's it. As far as I can tell, he has no particular training in disinformation, and he is obviously intensely hostile to both Russia and China, and completely committed to a neocon view of the world. But the Canadian media and political class have embraced this character as a so-called disinformation expert. So he somehow persuaded two right-wing senators, one of whom is Pamela Wallin, to co-author an op-ed in the Hill Times. And in the op-ed, what they say, this was this week, that people who are associating or collaborating with Russia Today, RT, the state broadcaster in Russia, or any other Russian state media, or with think tanks in Russia, should be investigated and prosecuted to the full force of the law. Now, why do I say that this is something that's personal to me and Radhika? Well, because both of us appear on RT, and Radhika also has a relationship with the Valdai Club and was actually at the most recent conference, and I invite Radhika to get into that some more. So this is a direct threat this is a threat directed at people like myself and Radhika and Alan Freeman, who also has collaborated for a number of years with the Valdai Club. And not only that, but on September 13th, the State Department of the United States came out and alleged that RT is basically an arm of Russian intelligence. That was the allegations. Antony Blinken laid it out without any evidence whatsoever, as is typical. And within hours, Melanie Joly, Canadian Foreign Minister, puts out a statement which is virtually identical to that of Antony Blinken, except for two things. One paragraph in her statement specifically referenced people in Canada who appear on RT. And she said that they're basically influencers that are being used by the Russian government to disseminate propaganda to the Canadian public. And around the same time that she put out that statement, Dominic LeBlanc, the Minister of Public Safety, said that anybody who is found to be illegally cooperating with the Russian government on the dissemination of disinformation would be prosecuted to the full force of Canadian law. So this is a very threatening environment in which to have any kind of a conversation with people who come from the official enemies of the West, as you can imagine. Now, the other thing that was very interesting about Mélanie Joly's statement is that she castigated RT for allegedly violating journalistic ethics by working with Russian intelligence. This is just a stunning level of hypocrisy. Why do I say that? Because when I was in Crimea last year, and I went to Russia and Crimea in order to learn more about Russia. I'd never been there before, at a time when we are locked in an existentially dangerous war with a nuclear armed state. That's essentially why I went there. And not because anybody paid me to go, not my expenses. I incurred them myself. None of them were reimbursed to me. This was my own idea. I didn't go pursuant to any invitation. And while I'm in Crimea, I get a call from a character named Adam Zivo, who is a columnist at the National Post. I don't think I need to tell you all about the political orientation of the National Post. And Adam Zivo says he wants to interview me on why I'm in Russia, in Crimea. And I said to him, I'll only do the interview on two conditions. One, you have to allow me to record the entire conversation so that you can't misrepresent what I say. And secondly, I have to be at liberty to publish the whole recording. He says, yes. So I did this. Now, no point,
Dimitri.
Okay. At no point during that conversation did Adam Zivo mention to me that at the time he was working with Canadian and Ukrainian intelligence services. How do I know this? Because in August of this year, Adam Zivo outed himself. He outed himself as a spy for Ukrainian and Canadian intelligence. Not only did he do that, but he said at the time when he revealed this information that he had advised the editors at the National Post that he was working with Canadian and Ukrainian intelligence. Now, at no point in time has the Canadian government denied, as far as I know, that Adam Zivo was working with CSIS during all of this time that he was stationed in Ukraine and writing these wars, these pro-NATO and anti-Russia articles for the National Post. And neither has the Canadian government or the National Post denied it. So I think we can safely assume that the allegation is true. So somehow, Mélanie Joly thinks that we should take lectures from her on journalistic ethics when her own government is working with a columnist from a national newspaper of Canada's largest newspaper publisher to write articles that support a proxy war in Ukraine. So this is what we're dealing with here, folks. We're dealing with a level of hypocrisy and dishonesty that boggles the mind. Now, at the end of the day, this is being used, as I say, to suppress our right to free speech. And all you have to do, I'm not going to get into the details of it because that would take me more time than I now have available to me. But I invite you to look at two articles that I've written on my website about Bill C-70 and Bill C-63. Okay, one is allegedly designed to address foreign interference. The other is designed to effectively terrorize social media companies into engaging in greater forms of censorship by subjecting them to potentially ruinous penalties if they don't censor information which runs afoul of these broad and amorphous terms in legislation. These are serious attacks on our free speech, both of these pieces of legislation. They are sailing through Parliament with virtually no criticism whatsoever. And as far as I can tell, they have the backing of virtually everybody in Parliament, including the Greens and the NDP, which I consider to be utterly disgraceful. But as I said, it's not just about free speech. It's also about drastically increased public spending on the military and on our security services, and adopting a very dangerously belligerent attitude towards nuclear armed states, principally China and Russia. So I invite you to look at those articles. To me, this should be a greater focus of the left in this country. We are not being sufficiently vigorous in defending our right to speak freely.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. So now we're going to move to our question Q&A period, and there'll be different formats as we go along. Sometimes it will be just one question and maybe somebody more. So our first question will come from Flo, and I think it's a standalone question. So go ahead, Flo.
Sure, thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you to our speakers. I think this kind of touches on what Tom put in the chat as well. Just hearing all of this, it's not a surprise as a socialist where it's, the effects of electoral politics are really, I mean, I think this is why it's an interesting conversation and topic, though, because yeah, you know, you both pointed out what's so striking about right now is, yes, there's so many people going to the ballot box, there's so many elections, and yet there's just so little actual democracy. And it does beg the question, you know, like, if that's the case, what is the role, or what are your thoughts on the role of electoral politics and electoralism in building an alternative movement, a revolutionary movement? Is it all too far gone? Are there certain strategies and interventions that you think would, you know, impact meaningfully, maybe certain policies that could shift us in the right direction, or other, you know, approaches to organizing and building power? Or is it all just kind of, we're on this trajectory because in all of our advanced Western societies, you know, there's a capitalist class that is doing all of the deciding for us. So yeah, just kind of a broad question on how we should kind of understand the dynamics of electoral politics within the sort of geopolitical order, and, you know, an understanding of that dialectic between our domestic policy and domestic interventions, and then the larger global stage, which seems to have forces that are, you know, so locked in and already in motion. So I will leave that there.
Okay. Thank you, Flo. So we're going to give each speaker 5 minutes to answer this question, and we will start with Dimitri and then Radhika. Does Dimitri get cut off again?
I think you may have, yeah.
Okay, Radhika?
Sure. Okay, so there's actually, it's a huge question. So just cut me off at 5 minutes, but it will take a lot longer than 5 minutes to answer. But let's try to make some brief points. Number one, electoralism. There's nothing wrong with electoralism. There's only something wrong if you pursue it as the sole method of trying to change things. I think in addition to electoralism, you need to have a broad movement on the ground that is going to be there behind you to back you up. Because the fact of the matter is that, and that's the second point I want to make, we are actually living in a time where capitalism is already past its sell-by date. It was actually so, I've now begun arguing that it was already there a century ago. And the only time when things worked well is in the post-Second World War period, when it was relatively reformed and it seemed to work well. But basically, since we have adopted neoliberalism, things have gone very rapidly, very downhill. And I didn't even mention I only mentioned briefly the militarism, etc. But Dimitri is right to point to this. And so this is where we are at. It's capitalism that can no longer compete against an organized socialist force, namely China. So that is becoming very clear. So then the third point I would say is that one thing we should not be doing, or two things we should not be doing, which dominated the period of neoliberalism. In a certain sense, I feel that the left had its own version of neoliberalism. What do I mean by that? While the corporate right was essentially talking about free markets, free trade, and in a very centralized fashion, transforming our politics into something far more pro-capitalist than it had been for several decades after the Second World War, we were, on the left, were talking about what I call prudhoist economics. So this idea that there's nothing wrong with capitalism so long as you don't have big capital. But you're not going to have that situation. The moment you have capitalism, small capital will become transformed into big capital. And in any case, it's already become big capital. So you're not going to have a situation in which you see every day how many businesses go bust because a Walmart has, the mom and pop stores that go bust because a Walmart has opened just even 10 kilometers down the road. It will affect them. So this is the kind of capitalism we're living in, and we are at the moment paying the price of keeping it alive. So we need a socialism. Prudhoist economics, we have to abandon. We have to understand that any kind of socialist economics is going to require a fair bit of centralized planning. I'm not suggesting that centralized planning should decide every little detail, But I would say that the commanding heights of our extremely monopolized economy will have to be publicly owned and publicly directed. I'm not talking about whether you leave various small businesses in operation, various cooperatives in operation, fine, all of that's fine. But you have to understand that there is some level of national level planning has to go on. And of course, the national economy's relation with the rest of the world has to be managed as well. And secondly, we can't do this without a party. This old type of network politics, somehow everything is going to be fine so long as we have little groups and groupuscles, at the local level. No, you should have them. Local groups should be there. They should be robust. They should be energetic. They should know what local people want, but they have to then compose a larger political structure, which is a national level political structure. So I would say that that's another thing that I would add. So anyway, for 5 minutes, I think that will do, and then we can come back to any other points that you may have to raise. But that's my response to your question.
Okay, thank you, Radhika. Dimitri, are you with us? And did you hear the question before you
I heard. All I understood that the question was about electoral politics, but I didn't really get the gist of the question.
Just kind of how it fits into, or if it does fit into, how we might actually affect some change in the geopolitical order, economic order that we're trying to see.
Okay, is that enough for you to get in on it for 5 minutes, Dimitri? Okay.
Sure.
All right.
I don't know. I don't know that I can fill up 5 minutes because
whatever.
my answers, pretty brief, and that is I have a very dim view of electoral politics, very dim view. I've run as a candidate, for the Green Party in London West, and I ran, as you all know, to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada. I believe the system is fundamentally rigged in all of the political parties that have a presence in Parliament to exclude candidates who have a radically left-wing perspective. In fact, candidates who even have a moderately left-wing perspective are finding it very, very challenging to make any headway in Parliament or to rise up in the hierarchy of the political parties. And this is the way these parties are structured. The parties are structured in a way, they're all filters effectively, all the political parties in Canada, and pretty much in all major Western countries. They act as filters to ensure that the people who rise to leadership levels within the party are always to the right politically of the base. So you have this in the NDP, you have in the Green Party, and in the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party's leadership is significantly to the right of the base. Just to give you an example, a large majority of Liberals want to see a wealth tax. But the leadership of the Liberal Party is adamant that they are not going to adopt a wealth tax, even a modest little puny wealth tax. The best way to solve this problem, I mean, it's not a sufficient solution, but it's part of the solution, is the candidate selection process and the leadership selection process in these parties has to be democratized to the greatest possible degree. And, what exactly that means is a long and detailed discussion, which, we're not going to be able to have here. But I think that has to be the overarching priority. But the other problem is the media system in this country. Any party, just to give you an example, as many of you know, I came very close to winning. I got 45.5% of the vote on the 8th and final ballot. And in the voting took place over the course of the week. And in the middle of the week, Global News does a hit job on me, in which Elizabeth May and the eventual winner, Annamie Paul, were savaging my reputation in the middle of the voting. And so, how can candidates of the left, particularly those with a radical orientation, make any headway in this political system when, most Canadians are getting most of their information from the corporate media, and the corporate media are employing every dirty trick in the book to vilify those of us from the left. I don't know what the answer is to, well, there are many possible solutions to the problem of corrupt media, but that has to be addressed. And unless, those two issues are addressed, I have no interest personally in running for political office again.
Okay, Radhika, I see
Yeah,
your
may I
hand
just
up to.
add something because I
Yes.
think, I mean, I completely agree with
Yeah,
what
you have
Dimitri
to,
says.
you still have 2 minutes if you want it.
Yeah, okay, because I completely agree with what Dimitri says, of course, but I just wanted to sort of relate that to what I was saying. So number one, I would say that sorry, you just shifted something, and I'm suddenly now seeing a big picture of me and distracted me. Okay, all the corruption that Dimitri is talking about in electoral politics and in the media is true. And so what does that imply? Number one, we need to create a different party, a new party. Of course, if it is possible to take over an existing left party, if the procedures of that left party have not been completely corrupted in such a way that a corrupt elite controls that party from top to bottom, then okay, there may be some, for a long time, people in the United Kingdom thought that the important thing to do is to take over the Labour Party. But essentially that today seems to be increasingly impossible, and more people are talking about creating a new party. So, and that new party presumably would be organized in such a way as to not be so corrupt and so on. As for the media, that's what I mean when I say that you need to have a dense network of organizations and a movement type network. In the days when Labour parties were actually strong, they actually had their own media. So that, different newspapers, and I mean the media environment was essentially one in which different political forces each had their own newspapers. And I mean, there are some vestiges of this still left. In the United Kingdom, for example, the Morning Star is still the Communist Party newspaper. So you need to create those sorts of forces, and we have to start. I mean, it's a big project, but if people really realize how dire the situation is, perhaps they will wake up and start organizing from the ground up. So yeah, I just wanted to add those two things.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the next two questions are going to be coming, and there's going to be two this time, panelists. So the first question will come from Barry Weisletter, and the second one will come from Suzanne Weiss. And Radhika will start first to answer, and then Dimitri, and you have 6 minutes each to answer these questions. So go ahead, Barry, you're the first question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, first of all, I want to thank Radhika and Dimitri for very illuminating presentations, a very poignant critique of the neoliberal status quo. I want to focus in a slightly different direction, and that is to challenges to the neoliberal agenda and vision on the potential for change as demonstrated by recent electoral results. And I want to refer to Sri Lanka, France, yes, even Argentina, and a different sort of example, the worldwide Palestinian movement, solidarity with the Palestinian people. So just to briefly explicate, in Sri Lanka, Anura Dissanayake, a longtime leader of the JVP, won the presidency of that country, which has a fairly long and profound tradition of radical politics, left-wing radical politics. That shakes things up considerably. In France, Macron miscalculated massively and followed up the elections for the European Union Council with elections in France, and Macron lost to the New Popular Front led by Mélenchon, the Insoumise party leader, and of course Macron is ignoring the results of the election, which goes to the points that the comrades have made already about the shrinking democracy. But nonetheless, it shows the power of mass mobilization in the streets and electorally. In Argentina, we still have a crazy right-wing president, but there are signs of life on the far left. The workers' left front, led by the Partido Trabajadores Socialista, the Socialist Workers' Party in Argentina, commands over 1 million votes, 1.5 million votes typically, and is probably the largest Trotskyist party on the face of the world. And I mentioned the movement of solidarity with the Palestinian people and opposition to the Zionist state, including its horrific attacks in Gaza, the West Bank, and now Lebanon.
One more minute, Barry.
I look forward to the speakers addressing that situation in Lebanon a bit more. All of these phenomena show the genuine potential for a radical, political, class-based alternative to capitalism and its rapidly shrinking democracy. It shows how we can rise to stop the far right without reliance on the BRICS or on populist notions of multipolarity or authoritarian regimes like the one in China. The key is to present a clear socialist policy standing on the principle of independent working class political action and not in alliance with liberal nationalist parties. Thanks very much.
Thank you. We've heard question 1. Now we will go to question 2. Suzanne?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Elizabeth. This is a wonderful discussion, and I am very pleased to be part of this. My question is this. Can you see me? No? Okay.
No, we can't, but we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, it's all right. The question is this: how do we challenge the authoritarian dictatorship which has the power internationally, and that is the United States? And of course, its minions, that is minions, M-I-N-I-O-N-S. And I want to say that, of course, there's no such thing as democracy. Whatever democracy we have, we won through the working class and its struggle. And we continue to have this struggle locally, that is in our own countries. But internationally, the dictator, the authoritarian is the United States. How do we challenge that? And we face a wider war as we see now with Lebanon in the Middle East. We face a nuclear war. We face a threat to climate change continually. The question is, how do we change the balance of power from the dictator, the US, to the popular people who have expressed their opinions about Israel and about racism generally? They have been in the streets continually for almost a year, and they have been using various tactics. One of the tactics—
30 seconds, Suzanne.
Thank you. One of the tactics that I really think that we should consider very seriously, and that is that of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Omar Barghouti and Ilian Pape say it best, that we have to challenge the ownership of capital. And the thing is we have to unite. We all have divisions, different opinions, but we have to unite and talk about how we can challenge this dictatorship.
That's right.
And I suggest
Thank you, Suzanne.
BDS is the issue.
Thank you, comrade. Okay, so we're going to go to Radhika first and Dimitri, and you each have up to 6 minutes.
So, okay. These two questions actually go slightly athwart each other. So I'll try and balance them. And obviously, I'll present my perspective, which is not necessarily the same as that of others. So, Barry, you asked about challenges to the neoliberal agenda and the potential for change, and you point to Sri Lanka, France, Palestine, solidarity, etc. And I agree with you that this is indeed what these elections represent. So do the elections recently in Germany. I would say that even many of the votes that are going to the AfD and other such forces, or even Trump for that matter, are really crying out for a change which is not there. The alternative is not there in front of them, which is why they are voting for such forces. So in that sense, I think that again I reiterate that there is a hunger for a clearly socialist direction, which is not being addressed by the existing party system. And we are seeing that again and again. And by the way, in case you are interested, I discussed the situation in Sri Lanka and more generally, but particularly insofar as we had any focus, it was on Sri Lanka with Professor Howard Nicholas, and that should be on YouTube very soon. That happened just a day or so ago, yesterday, I think. Absolutely. But at the same time, I just wonder whether your notion about, or your reference to what you call populist notions of multipolarity and what you call authoritarian China are particularly helpful. I'm not saying that China is some kind of a perfect socialism, but it is meaningfully socialist, and it is meaningfully different from the what Suzanne called the dictatorship that seeks to be a dictatorship, the would-be dictatorship over the world. I'll come to that in a second. So I would say that a large part of what is setting the left back is precisely these notions. And this is the counterpart to what I was earlier criticizing. When you have a politics which is primarily focused on what I call Proudhonist economics, this idea that there is a type of capitalism or market society that we can live with and so on, and we don't need centralized planning. And this idea that we don't need a political party, we are happy to have what I call network politics. The flip side of that is to consider any society in which there is substantial government intervention in the economy as an authoritarian society. But in my humble opinion, what I've argued in geopolitical economy and more widely, there is absolutely no way in which any country can develop without very substantial government planning, intervention in the economy, industrial policy, trade management, capital flow management, etc. That is the only way historically that countries have developed. So if you are saying that you wish to eschew these things, then essentially the train of the socialist left will never leave the station. It will remain stuck there for the rest of the while. So I think we have to take into account the fact that the achievement of socialism is going to be a long process, that process had already begun in 1917, that on the way, many mistakes have been made and will continue to be made, but this is the only way along which we must travel. So we have to take these forms of socialism seriously. The IMG manifesto is entitled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism. It allows every country to beat its own path towards, so it doesn't allow, but it envisages a situation in which every country will beat its own distinctive path there, but it will be broadly away from capitalism and towards socialism. And that path will necessarily involve, as I say, planning and party, and criticizing that is not going to help. Suzanne, I would say the only thing is, of course, I completely agree with you that we must challenge the power of the United States and its minions. I would only add that in doing so, we should not exaggerate the power of the United States. Part of what is happening, part of what explains US behavior is actually the fact that its power is declining. Its power to control what happens in the rest of the world is declining. And the principal reason why this power is declining is because China and a small number of other countries have acquired a sufficient power, economic power, as well as military, political, etc. power in the world system, so as to at least limit the United States' ability to do what it wants, if not entirely roll it back. So that
1 more minute.
That's what we call multipolarity. And multipolarity is, in fact, a positive thing, precisely because it limits the power of the United States, whose imperialist inclinations are rooted in capitalism. You know, there is another element of this idea of the left politics that I'm criticizing, is this idea that capitalism, imperialism happens. It's very bad when it happens. Capitalism even takes advantage of it when it happens, but it's not necessary to capitalism. I would reject that. It is deeply necessary to capitalism. That is why the capitalist era has been the most violent era known in the history of humankind. Thanks.
If I can just make a very quick point, 1 minute. I'm all in favor, as you well know, for profound economic planning. As Che Guevara said, nationalize the bourgeoisie right down to the nails in their boots. But what's missing in the existing forms is workers' control, unions controlled by workers, an end to national oppression, the right to strike. All of these things are missing in China, and that undermines the image of that being in the direction. What multipolarity is built on illusions, like the non-aligned movement led by Mao and Tito half a century ago. The Bandung Conference led to the Indonesia massacre in 1965. So yeah, more discussion is necessary, but thank you for engaging.
Thank you, Barry. And I would prefer that people get on the speakers list. It will be easier for us to get through things. Yes, Dimitri, sorry, comrade, your 6 minutes to answer your question.
I think arguably if not the most important speech, one of the most important speeches of the post-World War II era was that speech given by Dwight D. Eisenhower at the end of his presidency when he warned of the rise of the military complex. And within 10 years of him having delivered that really remarkable speech, I mean, we're talking here about an icon of the American military, a towering figure from the Second World War, warning in quite dark terms of the threat to American democracy of military contractors. And within a decade of him having delivered that speech, which it's not discussed even nearly enough nowadays, and most people, I think, in the world don't even know about it, they had assassinated JFK, who was, I think, making a concerted effort to de-escalate tensions with the Soviet Union for all of his flaws. They assassinated his brother, who towards the end of his life was, I think, showing some remarkable receptivity to socialist ideas, even though he wouldn't have called himself a socialist. They assassinated Martin Luther King. They assassinated Malcolm X. You know, if you've inferred from what I'm saying that I don't believe the official narrative about the killing of any of these men, you'd be correct about that. I don't purport to know exactly what happened, but I'm quite confident that somehow the national security state had something to do with the death of all of these individuals. And ever since then, it's been all downhill from there. I've watched with great frustration over the past year of genocide, the discussion around why the United States keeps sending weapons to Israel. And all we hear about is AIPAC this and AIPAC that. My God, AIPAC is so powerful. AIPAC runs the government. I think this is bullocks, okay? AIPAC is influential, but the power of AIPAC is a trifle compared to the power of the military-industrial complex. And they are the ones who are driving us off of a cliff. They are. And I cannot say this enough to my comrades on the left. We need to focus with laser-like energy on the military-industrial complex. Our highest priority should be to bring an end to war, to reduce military budgets to the greatest possible degree, to get us out of military alliances, to stop funding proxy wars. It was ridiculous, in my opinion, to see the so-called parties of the left in Canada's parliament, the NDP and the Greens, jump on the armed Ukraine bandwagon. That was a betrayal of everything they stand for. How could they not see that this war had nothing to do with democracy and human rights? We on the left, any of us, were persuaded that the reason why we sent collectively the West hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons and economic aid to Ukraine because we care about human rights, democracy, and international law. I mean, you'd have to be delusional to believe this. And yet we see people on the left. I got excoriated excoriated for 2 years for saying that we shouldn't be sending weapons to Ukraine by people on the left. There were many people who had supported me, self-professed socialists in the Green Party of Canada leadership contest, who said publicly to my face that they regretted having voted for me because I didn't support sending of weapons to Ukraine. This is a problem on the left. This has to be our number one priority: demilitarization, détente, peace, and disempowering the military-industrial complex and its vice grip over the public discourse. We can't solve the climate crisis. We can't have social justice. We can't avoid a nuclear war unless we do that. It should be our highest priority.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so we're going to go now for 2 more questions, and the first one is from Hans. Go ahead, Hans.
Yes, I believe I'm unmuted now, am I?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Dimitri, I've admired your outspokenness, your courage, and you stand out singularly against the political establishment that we've seen. I submit to you that a large factor in that was your very successful challenge to the Green Party leadership. Now we're staring down the face of a barrel of an impending federal election. And if I recall correctly, the NDP suffered its greatest losses following its support for the Liberals in the minority government. The most spectacular example of that was the challenge by Jim Laxer under the Waffle for an independent socialist Canada, where he garnered some, I think, 42% of the vote, running against the establishment figure of the day, David Lewis. The NDP will suffer a catastrophic defeat, and I predict that the leadership race is on the agenda. And I believe that this would give us a very effective platform, precisely on the anti-war front, where the NDP has grudgingly, more than any other political force, reinforced by the labor movement, Labor for Palestine, has shown some openness. And frankly, I could see no more effective challenger of the establishment of the NDP than yourself. So I would ask you to please, not today, but do reconsider that unfolding scenario.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for your very kind words, Hans. I just wanted to express my appreciation. If you want me to deal with that later,
No, okay.
I'll do that. Let me know.
Thank you. Our next question, I will read it, is from Tom. And he's saying, perhaps it has been partially answered before, but he would like to address this question to Radhika, but of course, Dimitri can also answer it. How should socialists intervene in elections if all the historical left parties have surrendered to neoliberalism? Is it worthwhile to fight inside these parties to expose and defeat the pro-capitalist leaders as part of a strategy to build a working class socialist party? And I will go to Radhika first and then to Dimitri, and you each have 5 minutes.
Well, I didn't hear the most of the second question, so I'll just leave that one to Radhika, unless
Okay.
I understand it was directed to Radhika. So
Yes, it was.
After I've heard Radhika speak, maybe I'll add something. But I need a clarification from Hans. Was Hans suggesting that I consider running to be the leader of the NDP, not the Greens? Was that the suggestion?
Yes, that's what
Of
Hans
course,
is asking.
of course. No, you made a successful debut on the Greens, and we consider the Greens to be a bourgeois party. I don't think you need convincing the German example, although even in the German example, the youth wing is now set out to form a socialist party and break away from the Greens.
Is my mon téléphone, non, il peut pas tout le monde mon téléphone. Qu'est-ce qui se passe là?
Oh, we lost him again.
Are you gone
Hello,
again?
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
No,
Maybe,
we can hear
Can you hear
you.
me now?
yeah,
Yes.
maybe just turn off
See,
your
see,
video
this
and
is a
we'll be able
sign
to hear you.
that, okay, I think this is a sign that I'm not meant to run for politics again, because I can't keep my hands wrapped.
No.
Oh, you're not getting out that easy.
Well, I would say to you at this stage, if I ever were to seek that kind of a position in electoral politics, I would be more inclined to do it in the NDP than in the Green Party.
Good.
For a number of reasons, which I don't have to get into. But first of all, the NDP base seems to have some kind of morbid fascination with mediocrity. I'm sorry to say why Jagmeet Singh is going to run in a third election. This is his third election, isn't it? Right? And he
We don't want to say.
my God, and you know, the party has this, the last poll I saw, it had lower levels of support than it did at the end of the last election, despite the catastrophic collapse of Liberal Party support. At this stage, I would have thought that the NDP base would be clamoring for a leadership change. Do they really want to go into the next election? Does anybody in the NDP believe there's going to be a significantly better outcome with Jagmeet Singh as the leader and the same milquetoast, mediocre policies? You know, he just loves positioning the party slightly to the left of Justin. That's a failed strategy. So I don't know. I mean, if the party's members can remove him from power and open up the leadership again, I would think about it. I would think about it. But you know, that's the fundamental problems in electoral politics remain. And
Well, the
those need to be-
Socialist Caucus would certainly support you.
Well, I hope you speak for the entire caucus, because I would need you.
I'm sure she does.
We would
Major
convince
buck.
the ones that wouldn't. Okay, sorry. Are you finished?
Yes, I'm finished. Yes.
Okay,
So-
thanks. Radhika?
Yeah, sure. So all I would say is that the question of whether, so, you know, it's true that the historic parties of the left have been taken over by essentially a leadership, which I consider to be not a working class leadership, but essentially coming from the professional managerial classes that have essentially transformed the politics of these parties into a kind of astroturf politics, in which basically there is very little representation, in which a political class, which one political scientist called let me rephrase that. They have turned a mass party into first a catch-all party, or mass parties of working people had been turned into catch-all parties in the post-Second World War period. And since then, they have become what one political scientist called cartel parties. That is to say that they are essentially parties that form a cartel with other establishment parties. There is essentially a fair degree of agreement. I mean, there is cross-party agreement on neoliberalism, and then just small things to distinguish them from one another. So, you know, it's like a Coke versus Pepsi type of thing. So to get out of this situation, then there are only two options. One, and you have to decide which course you will take. One is to create a new party to which you will attract the working class. And I would like to underline one other thing, which is that in too many Western countries like ours, working class organizations remain dominated by a labor aristocracy. They also remain dominated by essentially a white working class politics, privileged working class politics. And really, we have to understand that the working class is increasingly multicolored in all of these societies. So you have to create a new party that represents all that, or you try to take over a party from within. And if in the scenario that we were just discussing vis-a-vis the NDP, if Dimitri does run, that would be a good thing. You know, or if we, let me rephrase that, we could take a contextual decision in which a proper socialist, eco-socialist, and anti-imperialist candidate will run. Because the other thing that has happened, of course, is the full maturation of the guns and butter compromises that the historic parties of the Western working classes have made going back a century and more. So all of that has to go, and you need to have, if you agree with what Dimitri said, that we need to fight the military-industrial complex, you're not going to do it with the type of foreign policy that we have in the NDP today. You'd have to have a very, very radically different working NDP foreign policy. Etc. So the decision as to whether to create a new party or to take over an existing party has to be a contextual one.
Thank you. Okay, so we are going to take one more question from Flo, and then we will that I will give the panelists 3 or 4 minutes to answer, and then give them a 5-minute wrap-up time. If there's something they missed along the way that they want to say now, it's their opportunity to do so. So I will go to Radhika and then Dimitri after Flo asked a question, with 5 minutes at the end to wrap up. Go ahead, Flo.
Thanks. Yeah, you know what you're talking about, I like that phrase cartel party, and it does bring to mind, you know, what we have been discussing as well, which is the problem, I think, is so advanced because it's not only within the political party that there is a brass, but there seems to be a sort of revolving door of the elites or the brass, you know, the pro-capitalists at the top of all of our what are supposed to be social institutions, you know, labor. There's a revolving door between the party brass of the NDP and labor bureaucrats. The media, as we have been talking about, is similarly captured by, you know, those interests. And also, as Dimitri was speaking, like legal institutions, the military industrial complex, and, you know, even these deep state actors and sort of national security interests. So it does seem like there's a divergence of, you know, class really in all of our different institutions, whether they're supposed to be neutral or, you know, socially progressive or whatnot. So I suppose my question is then, what are your thoughts on that? And does that change maybe our tactics or strategy for how we can effectively intervene?
Sorry, how does what change our...
Just that understanding that, you know, there's a cartel politics, not only between political parties, but also the media and labor and various kind of social institutions.
Okay, so I can answer that very briefly. I think what it shows is that we have to go, we have to create our own political movement, party, media, etc. You see, I think people forget that the labor movements that were sort of once relatively successful in gaining some major concessions for working people, at least some working people, they were not just a political party. There was a dense undergrowth of organizations and an enormous amount of resilience and ability to withstand attacks from capitalist forces and so on. And I think that that's what we need to rebuild, and we are not going to do that unless, as I say, we recognize that we need a national party organization and that we will need to have eventually some kind of planning going forward, and etc. So I mean, I think, and so at the moment, you know, we are very much kind of sitting ducks for the media. I mean, Dimitri described how so many people, you know, who are taking critical positions are now under attack, and we have to create the organizations and institutions to resist that, to insist on our rights. I mean, Suzanne Weiss pointed out that, you know, democracy is not given to us as a gift from somebody. Every bit of it has to be fought for. And I think somehow in all the celebration of democracy in recent past, this idea that somehow only capitalism is democratic and socialism is inherently authoritarian, etc. I think that the other thing, just going back to Barry's point, we also have to think about different types of democracy. Liberal democracy, with its competition between rival parties, etc., is not necessarily the only type of democracy. And one of the things that perhaps we should have some discussion of, if you like, is what China calls its whole process democracy. So think about all the different ways in which you could do this. But I think, and I should maybe just say one other thing, which is that it's interesting, but the ruling parties and the ruling forces in China, and I would say even Russia, have today a greater legitimacy than the ruling forces in our societies do. And nevertheless, we still insist on calling them undemocratic and sort of lauding ourselves for being democratic. I think there's a problem here somewhere. So I'll just say that for now, and yeah.
Okay. So if you just wish to just wrap up a little bit, then if just something you missed along the way that you really want to say, Dimitri, because I think Radhika answered the question, you can do that if you wish.
I'm simply going to stress what I tried to convey in my presentation and these answers, and that is the number one threat by far to humanity now, and to all we hold dear, including democracy, is war, by far. And to those who devote much of their time to the climate crisis, I personally made a decision that this is not going to be a significant area of activity for me, climate change. Not because I fear the consequences of runaway climate change any less, not because I'm any less convinced the necessity of dealing urgently with that issue, but because we were not going to have the luxury of having to deal with the climate crisis unless we stop these wars now. This should be the singular objective of us all. That's my closing thought. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, again, a special thanks to both Radhika and Dimitri. We're so glad to have you. It was very educational and inspiring in a lot of ways. I would like to also thank everybody that participated, including Flo Sherrod, who is our political producer, Imogen Xavier, our membership engagement coordinator, and Carrie V, our technical producer. So Socialist Action aims to overthrow capitalism and to establish socialism, feminism, and workers' power. SA is celebrating its 30th anniversary of our party this year, 2024. Folks who wish to join, please let us know today or just call 647-986-1917. For more information about Socialist Action conferences, forums, film nights, and study groups held throughout the year, please provide your phone number and email address tonight if you haven't already, or sign in at the SA website, www.socialistaction.ca. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to the Red Review Journal by visiting www.redreview.ca. So once again, thank you all for joining this event. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be active. Bye for now.